Could we start then with the how you came to be in the army in the first?
Yes, I had always wanted to be in the Navy, but I didn't make the medical purely on eyesight grounds, which was rather strange because my eyesight was good enough to do a great many things later in life, but it wasn't good enough for the Navy pre-war. And so I joined the Supplementary Reserve Officers and was commissioned in January 1939 and went down to the Tank Regiment Depot, Bovington, for initial training, and on from there to the Gunnery School at Lulworth. And then I went to 7th Battalion RTR Catterick for the next 3 months, which brought us up just about to the outbreak of war. And I was immediately, of course, recalled back to the battalion. So I went back to the 7th RTR back in Catterick and spent the winter there training with what equipment we had, which, let it be said, was pretty minimal. In fact, we got the Mark II infantry tank Matildas, and by this time we're down at Aldershot. I was down at Aldershot, and we did our training on like everybody else on Lapham's Plain outside Aldershot, and along with the tanks, with the Mark II Matildas, came a booklet sort of indicating what they were supposed to do. But and one of the things they did put in the booklet was a cross-section of an infantry trench which they were alleged to cross. Now I suspected, by this time I was a battalion technical adjutant, and I suspected that what I had seen in the performance of the tanks, they would not cross that particular trench. And I raised this with my commanding officer, who incidentally had commanded a tank battalion in World War I. He was the only, to the best of my knowledge, the only serving officer in the tank, commanding a tank battalion who had actually done the job previously. And he was a pretty forthright sort of guy, and he said, right, better go and find out, take some chaps and dig a trench. So I went out and dug a trench to the exact dimensions that given in the cross-section drawing in the book, and drove a tank at it myself, and it went straight up on its back and rolled over onto its back. It wouldn't clear the trench at all. And we did this on a Saturday morning, and I, in my starry-eyed innocence in those days about what tanks did and didn't do, I tried to recover the tank. I winched a rope and I attached it to the nearest telegraph pole I could see, the base of a telegraph pole, and tried to get this tank back on its tracks right way up. And in doing so, I pulled down the telegraph pole, which contained most of the transmissions to and from the Aldershot Command, as far as I could gather, of which I got the most enormous rocket eventually. But anyway, that was all sorted out, and we got the tank back on its wheels, and the information was conveyed back to MeWE's Mechanical Warfare Experimental Establishment, which is, I think, a colonel called Doc Cooper, and they came up with a thing called a duck's arse, which was not a semicircle, a quarter of a circle, sort of hollow tank, which was bolted onto the stern of the tank. The idea being this would, as the tank, the rear of the tank fell into the trench, so this semicircular section bolted on the back would enable the tank to drag its way out of the trench. All this seemed quite pointless to me, because it's quite obvious that there wasn't going to be very much trench warfare. However, the next thing we did, we went down to South Wales, to Linney Head in South Wales, where we were going to do a shoot, and as you know, most exercises start with a start line. In this case, it was a hedgerow from which a hedge had been removed, but the hump in the ground where the hedge had been growing was still there. And the colonel was down there with us, our commanding officer, and he said, "Okay, off you go," and we got the start time and crossed the start line. Well, of course, the wretched tanks wouldn't go over this hump in the ground. They just dug in. The reason being, to the best of my knowledge, was that the tanks were roughly the same size as the old medium tank from 1923, 24, and they had the same track dimensions. But whereas the medium tank weighed something like 12.5 tons, the Mark II Matilda was over 25 tons, so they got twice the weight on the same track area, which again seemed to me wrong somewhere. And when these tanks wouldn't go over this hump in the ground, I said to my commanding officer, I said, "Well, I get a 50 hundredweight pickup over there," and he said, "Right, let me see you." So I jumped into a Bedford pickup, threw it at this bump in the ground, and sure enough it bounced over it, which the tanks wouldn't do because they were extremely slow things anyway. And so that information went back to to MeWE's, and eventually we got, they were putting wider tracks on the tanks. So that's fair enough. Eventually they got the things sorted out. The other thing was that they were twin engine, they were AECs or Leyland diesels, and operating a self-changing 5-speed gearbox, which was vacuum shifted. Now we found that to turn one of these tanks you had to go down through the gears to provide sufficient torque for the engine at low speed to turn the tanks by locking one set of tracks or the other. And as you went down through the gears in this automatic box, you were exhausting the vacuum. So as you try to go, say, from second to bottom, it didn't shift because there was no vacuum left. Now, this in the middle of a battlefield could be extremely embarrassing, because the only way you could get the thing either out of second and into neutral, or back into bottom, wherever you wanted it, was climb on the back, open the big armoured doors over the engines, and with a crowbar lever the bus bar out of kilter, so you got into neutral. In order to overcome this problem, I designed and had manufactured for our tanks a threaded rod with a hand wheel, so that if the thing stuck in gear, instead of getting out of the tank, all you had to do was wind this threaded rod through, and it would push against it and bang it into neutral, which seemed to work very well. And so that was our training. Of course, the winter of 39-40 was extremely cold, and we had quite a few exciting incidents with tanks during that winter on the ice. However, eventually we were ready to go to France, and we went down to load the wretched things onto, we had to put them all on these Continental trucks, flatbed trucks, which are called conflats. And we did this and went down to Dover with a trainload of these tanks, And of course, as we drove onto one set of rails on the ferry, so the ferry went over to one side, and they had another job sorting the ballast out to get it level so we could get the corresponding lot on the other set of tracks. Anyway, we got to France, and we carried on there. The other thing was that HM Ordnance Office had promised us maps of the area in which they thought battle would take place, if any, and these were going to be produced eventually, but all our training was done and we had to go and buy Michelin maps from the local post office, as it were, because the maps never arrived. And eventually, when the balloon went up on May 10th or whenever it was, the battalion went up to Belgium to Waterloo, where they confronted the Germans, and eventually, like the rest of the BEF, had to retreat. And in the meantime, because I was battalion technical adjutant, I'd been detached from the battalion to go and collect various bits of flotsam and jetsam which the battalion required, like a few motorbikes and some sort out some tanks and armament. And as of course the war erupted with great speed, I was caught up in the retreat to some extent, and eventually joined a force which was called Beauforce, which was a force made up of odds and sods who'd been rounded up because they happened to be there, in effect. And we battled our way back and over the Seine, and there was no air support. We were continually bombed, of course, by Junkers, 88s, 87s, whatever. And I was eventually sent on a motorcycle to reconnoitre a small town, the name of which escapes me at the moment, which was in flames, and which it was assumed, for some reason, that the Germans had been bombing, and I was to go and see, if their forward elements were anywhere near the town. And it so happened, it must have been the only town in the whole of France that actually had been bombed by the French Air Force, because the Germans were already in there, and apparently 3 or 4 French aircraft had been detached to drop a few bombs on them. And so the story was quite wrong. I wasn't going into a town full of French people, French troops, being bombed by the Germans. I was going to a town full of Germans being bombed by the old French aircraft. And so it was daylight, of course, and I lay up for a long time. I got off my bike and lay up on a hill overlooking it, a pair of binoculars, and I couldn't see any movement. I couldn't see anything worthwhile except smoke and stuff, and buildings were sort of tumbling down. And so I got off the bike, rode the bike a bit further on. I got off the bike and decided to go in on foot to see if I could make contact with the local citizenry. And of course, I walked bang into a German patrol, all with sort of automatic weapons, and that was the end of the story, really. They put me on the back of a truck because they were totally overwhelmed with prisoners they got. Obviously, Germans, they had no idea they were going to have all these prisoners, because apart from the British, they had an enormous number of French POWs to cope with. They had to, somehow or other, they had to get them back, and they had to feed them and so on. Anyway, this was a soft top truck, a truck with a canvas tilt over the back, and it was full of, they filled it full of Senegalese troops, the black Senegalese gunners they were, and they said to me, I was the only white guy there, and they said, you don't want to get in amongst this lot, do you? You get by the tailboard, and you'll be all right there. And they went around with rifle butts, banging anything that stuck out, and they left me alone. And they treated me quite civilly, and off we set. There were no guards in the back at all, because they obviously knew that these black characters weren't going to try and jump off. They got nowhere to go anyway. And so there I was in the back of this truck, and we went through the Forêt de Lyon, and I thought this was the time to abandon ship. So I jumped off the back of the truck, and nobody seemed to take a slight bit of notice. I don't think anybody, if anybody had seen me, which they didn't, the Germans didn't know, I don't think they'd have bothered, because they weren't very worried about 2 or 3 odd British POWs wandering about at that time, certainly. The country was full of all sorts of odd people wandering about. And I met up, eventually I kept walking, and I met up with a guy who was apparently, had been a Polish miner. Quite a lot of Polish miners had come down to the mines in northern France to work, and he lived in a little cottage, single-storey cottage, and I stayed there for a while, and I thought this was getting a bit too dodgy for him. I'd better move on. So I got out and went on my way, and I've been loose on my way. I decided, rather than go to the coast, which I think a lot of people thought the first idea, might get to the coast and possibly steal a boat or something, I thought it would be much better if I went south, because I knew the main push of the Germans was westward, and I thought if I could go south, I might possibly get into what eventually became unoccupied France. Not that I knew then it was going to be unoccupied France, but after I'd been moving for 3 or 4 days, I was asleep. I was very weary and hungry, and I fell asleep, and I just happened to be picked up by a German patrol, and I eventually ended up as a POW in Laufen.
Do you remember how you got to Laufen?
Yeah, I went by on a truck for quite a distance. Then I joined a column of French prisoners who were all marching along with their suitcases and things. They'd been allowed to take suitcases and all sorts of things. I think they were going on holiday. And we marched off, and then eventually we brought down the Rhine, the Waal, is it? The Waal or the Scheldt or something, the mouth of the Rhine. We embarked on the boat there and went down the Rhine, then onto a train somewhere not too far from Nijmegen, probably. Anyway, we got on a train, and we were taken eventually. The French by this time had all disappeared, and I was with 1 or 2 other people, English characters, who we all ended up in Laufen eventually. I don't know who they were, I lost touch with them. And there I was in Laufen, my first prisoner of war camp. And I don't really remember very much about Laufen, because I'd had one go at escaping, and because I'd arrived on my own, and none of my own regimental officers there, as far as I could see, I was rather an oddball character, and didn't know. I wasn't part of a group, as it were. Quite a lot of people in Laufen their regiment had been sort of attacked by the Germans. They'd been taken prisoner as a group, and so they had friends, and they were mutually supportive. I was on my own, and didn't really know anyone.
Had the Pat Reed and Peter Allen escape taken place by the time you got there? Or?
No, they apparently were involved in it, I think, then. But as I say, I was in effect an outsider. I was one person on my own and had no access to. I sussed the place out on my own, looking for possible solo efforts, but I couldn't really. I don't think I was in a very fit state to do anything much about it, because I hadn't eaten anything for quite a long time, and the German rations were not very good, as you know. And going upstairs, one had to sort of halt after a couple of flights and sort of get your breath back again and carry on up the next lot of stairs.
Were there no Red Cross parcels at Laufen?
No, nothing came for, I don't think, for about 6 months, something like that. I did in fact get one parcel from Lady Eichstadt Mob, who was the wife of, I think her husband was the ambassador in Turkey or something, but through family connections she was made aware I was in Germany at Laufen, and she did manage to get, I think, 1 or 2 parcels through to me. That's all, and I was very lucky, because not many people were getting anything. But at that time, the Germans and the Turks seemed to be reasonably friendly, and so anything from Turkey the Germans allowed through for some reason. But that was that. No, Red Cross passes didn't come for quite a long time, and a lot of people were pretty ill, really, and people were having nightmares and that sort of thing. Their experiences had got to them, and also many of them were suffering withdrawal symptoms, not getting cigarettes, because everybody in those days smoked. I never smoked at all, but I teamed up with a guy, Welshman actually, named Gregory, who was quite a heavy smoker, and he had all my cigarettes because I didn't need them, and it sort of staved off the evil day for him anyway, having nightmares about no cigarettes. But my experience at Laufen were not very undistinguished, really. I did nothing.
How long were you there for?
How long was I there? I don't know. I moved on, I suppose, when the mass of people moved on to, where did we go then? To Biberach, or from there I think I went to Biberach, that's right, yeah.
Which was whereabouts in Germany?
Southern Germany in Bavaria. And a number of people did escape from there, and there were 1 or 2 home runs from there. It was a very pleasant camp, but it was a bit too close to Schaffhausen, really. The Germans made a mistake there, because it wasn't very far to the frontier. And again, I didn't have any hand in anything there very much, and it wasn't from there we were moved to Dusseldorf, and there I met 1 or 2 sort of people that like-minded sort of people that I got to know. And in Dusseldorf, it's a very big camp, and there the Germans put all the RAF naval and military officers together in one big camp. They seemed, for some reason, thought that was a good possibility. And it was a hutted camp, surrounded the usual way by wire, except for one end, which had a building made of brick, or was referred to as the brick building, which was a long building along one side of the wire and quite close to the wire, quite close to the perimeter wire. And there were small rooms in there, and I managed to get a room which I shared with 3 other people, one of whom was George Drew, and the other 2 were Pip Varley in the Warwickshire Regiment, and Gunner Webb, who was a gunner, obviously. And the 4 of us decided it was time we did something about getting out. Underneath us was quite a large cellar in which the Germans, they had a trapdoor, and they brought truckloads of turnips and shot them down through the trapdoor and stacked them against a wall, where in the winter they were very frozen, hard to move. But we decided if we could get access to this cellar, we could perhaps start a tunnel from the cellar. A number of tunnels had been attempted in Dusseldorf, and indeed one officer was electrocuted down one tunnel. Instead of using fat lamps for illumination, they'd tapped into the mains, and he was unfortunately electrocuted. That blew that one, and 1 or 2 other tunnels, it's very sandy soil, and 1 or 2 of the tunnels collapsed. Other ones were given away because the spoil from the tunnel had been put in the roofs of the huts, and then the roof would collapse because people didn't realise how many tons of soil were coming out of a tunnel. Anyway, we decided we'd have a go, and we made a trap. First thing we had to do was to gain access to the cellar. So we made a trap, which we could, by removing bricks from the wall, the trap outline would fit into the hole we'd made in the bricks, and we made a facing for the trap, and onto the facing we screwed sort of 1/4 thickness bricks so that it looked like a piece of the wall from either side, either looking at it from the cellar side or from the corridor side where we had access, walking down the corridor. And so that way we had access to the cellar. Before the trap was finished, we had one of their sudden searches, and all they did, they came in, they were not really looking for anything, but they came in and chucked everything out of the window, and it was up to you to get you back in again when they're finished. And we had this trap in the room, and it was, I suppose it's about 3 feet wide and about 2 feet high, and we didn't know what the hell to do with it, so we knocked a couple of nails in the wall, hung it on the wall and put a few bits and pieces on it, and the Germans came in, looked around, threw everything out of the window, looked at this, took no notice of it, went away again. And so that's how we got away with that particular search. Then we made the facing boards and put the bricks on and stuck it all together, and it slotted beautifully into the wall where we took out the bricks. And so we had access to the cellar. Having got down into the cellar at night, because nobody went near the place at night, the guards wandered around the perimeter, but we could work in the cellar quite cheerfully. Nobody came near it. It was very cold. It was winter, and the pile of turnips against the wall, the outer wall, which we hoped would lead under the wire and into the next compound, which is a recently built compound, and in which the Germans were building brick huts to house an influx of expected Russian POWs. The huts were finished but not glazed and had no doors on, had no concrete floors, just sandy floors, and it seemed that it would be not too far to go to dig a tunnel under the perimeter road and the perimeter fence, and with luck we might come up in a room in one of these huts. It required fairly careful calculation to make sure we did come up there, both direction-wise and distance-wise. But we started with, first thing to do, we had to move a whole stack of turnips, and then we had to make another trap in that wall in a similar fashion to the trap we'd already made in the upper wall to get from the corridor down to the cellar. And this was done and put in, and the turnips, every night the turnips were put back and so on. And we started to dig. We took it in turns, and we made good progress. One of the problems, as most people involved in any sort of POW activity know, is getting rid of the earth you take out of the tunnel. And we were lucky because outside the brick block there was a bare stretch of earth about 3 or 4 feet wide, which at some time must have been a garden. And we asked the Germans if we could have it as a garden, and they were quite happy about this. They said, yeah, do what you like, as long as you keep out of our way. And so we started on the garden, and in fact 1 or 2 of the guards did occasionally bring a few plants in for us. It was quite interesting. And so we gardened, and of course every bit of soil we got out of the tunnel went in the garden, and because it was a fairly large area it didn't grow too high too quickly, and nobody ever spotted it. Nobody ever knew where the spoil went that we got out of the tunnel. And so that was a fairly successful arrangement, much better than anything else that was being done. And as we progressed along the tunnel, I was not worried about being stuck in a fairly claustrophobic state. It didn't worry me very much, being unimaginative. And so I was put in to dig after the morning counting parade and got out before the afternoon one. So I was stuck in there on my own with a fat lamp and to dig, and I did the digging, and then somebody else went in when it was appropriate, the right sort of time to drag the soil out that I'd shifted, which worked very well. I only had one hiccup there. I was in the tunnel and very confined space, and I reached behind myself to get one of the fat lamps which had gone out, to get it around to the front to light it up again, and I dislocated my left shoulder, which anybody who had a dislocated shoulder will know is extremely painful. And I thought, here I am, dislocated shoulder, sweat pouring off my face. What do I do? I thought, well, there's only one thing to do. You've got to put the bloody thing back in yourself. So I managed to get myself in a sort of position, and I managed to work my upper arm above the elbow in between my knees, and by wrenching it about, eventually I put my shoulder back in, which was a great relief, and carried on digging. And that was the only hiccup we had. And as we got closer to the hut, it became more critical that we did some fairly accurate measuring, both on depths and everything else. And we did 1 or 2 test boreholes up to the surface, and we were very close to our objective. I don't know how long it's taken, 6 or 7 months probably, something like that. It was getting towards the summer. And eventually we reckon we were under one of the rooms in the hut nearest to the wire. The idea being that George and I would go out first, and if the thing was successful, if we got out without being detected, as we got out, we would take with us a prefabricated trap and some woodwork to put in the hole we'd left, so the trap could be replaced once we'd got out, and then the sand just brushed over, because as I said earlier, the hut's not been finished, they were just a sandy floor. And this was the scheme, hoping that perhaps another night after us somebody else can have a go at getting out. Yeah, and when we had got out, we had to then get to, in daylight, dressed as German workmen. We had to wander across to their workman's hut, which they used to keep their tools in and their equipment and stuff. We then had to pick the lock on that to get in it, under the gaze of the watchtowers, and we disappeared in there and hoped that we'd just be taken for German workmen and nobody would know what time we went in or what time we came out, or the fact that we didn't in fact come out at all. So this was the plot. We broke the tunnel about just after the Germans had knocked off themselves. They'd all gone into their little hut and dispersed, gone back home wherever they went, and so we decided it's a good time to break the tunnel, and we were greatly assisted in this because we had 2 people to talk us through what we were doing. One was Brocky Mitten and the other was Hector Christie, both extremely competent people. Brocky was the descendant of Squire Mitten, who I think was the innovator of the point-to-point racing, and Hector Christie eventually became the racing correspondent for Sunday Times, I think. But they were jolly good chaps, and we found that once we'd poked a hole through into the floor of this hut, that we could talk to them in a perfectly conversational voice, and they could tell us when the sentry was walking down the wire towards us, so we'd all stop and we wouldn't start talking again until the sentry had passed on, and one of the Hector or Rocky Mitten would talk to us and say, "Okay, chaps, get going." And so we made the framework for the trap at the exit to the tunnel. We then put the trap back in. We covered it very carefully with sand and just strolled out of the hut and across the German workman's hut, having been told they'd all gone by then. So this was in daylight.
In the tunnel under the hut, with just
we tunnelled under the hut and we went up vertically into the floor of the hut.
But while you were still in the tunnel, that you were talking to these guys who were...
Yeah, not while we were in the tunnel, but we poked a little hole and we could hear, you know, it's quite extraordinary because you can get right, as you get up and see the grass roots and that sort of thing, you can hear people very clearly through the soil, yeah. So we were talked into the right sort of attitude, and we went to the hut and picked the lock, went in, and just kept our fingers crossed that A, that no Germans came back for anything they'd forgotten, and B, that any guards who'd seen us going in there would just assume that we'd gone in and we were ordinary workmen, and that the guard would change and nothing would be said. The new guard would come on, wouldn't know we were in there anyway, and so we waited till dark, and then we had to cut our way through the wire to get out. And that winter the Red Cross had sent us a few ice skates, and we made an ice skating rink which we flooded, and then it froze of course so people could ice skate. And ice skates made very good wire cutters actually. They're very good quality steel and that sort of thing. And so we got through the wire, and George and I, off we went.
Was it used again?
Pardon?
Was it used again on
subsequent nights? Yes. The following night, Pip Varley and Gunnar Webb got out and went through the same motions, and they were successful. They put the trap back. On the third night, they tried to get, I think, they tried to get 6 people out, because I was not there, of course, then, but that's why I understand. And it was just too many. It was a crowd, and they were spotted and apprehended. But they'd had time, of course, to put the trap back. And but then the camp security officer at Dusseldorf and his ferrets knew where they'd come from, so they went in. They found the exit to the tunnel, and they were then sent into the camp apparently to try and find where it started, and they never did find it. What they did, the security officer sent one of his ferrets down the actual tunnel from the outlet to find out where it came out in the camp, and that's how they detected it. So that's how good it was. And they found out that it came out in the tunnel. The tunnel came out in the cellar where the turnips were, but they never did know. They never found the trap, which was in the wall above. How we got into the tunnel, they didn't tumble to that at all. They thought we must have got in through one of the doors or one of the outside hatches, something like that. So that was a fairly successful tunnel, really, in a camp in which I think there was probably just one other successful tunnel, which was given away almost immediately because I think Dougie Barder tried to go through it and he got caught on the exit. But otherwise, there was nothing successful in the way of tunnelling. And so George and I plodded off into the night and lay up during the day, as usual thing.
Where were you aiming for?
We were aiming for Schaffhausen, of course, going south. And we'd made a mistake. We'd taken food with us, which was too sweet. Chocolate was the big thing. People said you must take chocolate if you escape, you know, it's very nourishing and so on. And so you have a whip round with all your friends who've got a bit of chocolate out of Red Cross parcels and the escape committee and so on. And you get sent out with blocks of chocolate and some porridge, oats, mixed with sugar, because it's all supposed to be sustaining. Well, however fond you might be of chocolate and sweet porridge, after you've eaten this for about 3 or 4 days with nothing savoury, you just don't want to see any more of it at all. So you couldn't face another bit of chocolate or boiling up porridge at night before we're on the move. You couldn't get the sugar out of it, of course. It's already mixed in this little bag you carry around your neck, under your coat, under your clothes, and so we pinched the odd vegetable out of fields and that sort of thing. And as I'm sure you know, in Germany, all the apple trees and fruit trees grow alongside the roads. You can just help yourself to that sort of thing. But we've gone quite a long way, and we lay up in a. Just trying to think where we were. I can't remember where we were. But we'd gone quite a reasonable distance. We'd been up something over a fortnight, and we got caught, and were brought back to Dusseldorf.
Whereabouts were you when you were caught? Do you remember? I
can't remember. No. I'm not very good at this sort of thing. This sort of thing they asked me at the debriefing after we got back to the UK. You know, where were you on the 19th of June in 1942 or something? You know, and what time of the day was it? I haven't got a damn clue. But I know that we made fairly good progress, really, and I can't for the life of me think how we got caught. We'd hopped a train at one point, that's right, and we got off in daylight at a station and all the workers had arrived by train to go to their work, wherever it was in this little village, and we got sneakers on, of course. We got rubber-soled boots on, and they'd all got these clogs or heavy-soled boots, you know. And I thought, God, yeah, somebody's going to spot it. Not making any noise soon. They're all clattering around us. Anyway, we didn't get spotted, and we kept on walking, and eventually we got into country and nobody spotted us, and so we got away with that one, and we lay up during the day and we kept going. But I just cannot, it's one of these blank spots, I just can't remember how on that particular escape I got caught again.
Story or any papers?
No, we didn't have anything.
Nothing at all?
No, I got a sort of basic map, but we hadn't got any help from the escape committee. In fact, I had been threatened with court-martial by a fairly senior officer if I carried on trying to escape the way I was.
That was
That's Dusseldorf, yeah.
there was one or two instances of that, wasn't there?
I believe there were. I believe, yeah. Well, you know, the state, the thing with some of these senior officers, comfort before country. That was the slogan. Anyway, I'd been threatened, and I got no help from anybody. In fact, none of it. We didn't get any help. We had a period. I got candles for digging the tunnel. Because you knew it, a fat lamp or a candle you had, a little stub of a candle. If it went out, the oxygen was getting a bit thin, so you came trying to get out. But candles you couldn't get. But I was very lucky. We had a very cooperative major in the gunners who shared a room. Being a major, he just shared a room with one other person who was also a major, and who was a Catholic padre. He'd been a Pope's messenger, and because he was allowed to have Catholic services in the camp, he had some candles. He was allowed to have candles, which the Germans supplied him with. But his roommate, every now and again, would filch one and pass it over to us. So that was our illumination came largely from that source.
Did you then, once you were captured, you went back to Dusseldorf?
Went back to Dusseldorf, and we were interrogated, and then we were sent off to Zost, a civilian jail in Zost, and we were in a vestibule coach with our guards full of people who'd been bombed out of the Ruhr and were being evacuated somewhere else. And we thought that one of the old boys came up and started chatting to our guards, and he explained we were prisoners of war, being punished and this sort of thing. And he'd been a POW in the UK in the First World War, and he pulled some tatty old photographs out of his pocket and showed us how well he'd been treated in England and this, that and the other, and how fond he was of England and so on. And we sort of said, hang on a minute, you've just been bombed, all these people have just been bombed out of their homes. He said, yes, but we bombed Coventry and we must expect this war, it is so stupid. And then he made a little speech to everybody in the carriage, saying who we were and why we were there. And they all came up to shake us by the hand. It was really quite touching, and we had some, when you went on a train journey, they were always looking for a chance to escape off a train, so again we had chocolate and cigarettes with us, and we dished out chocolates to the children, cigarettes to the men and women that smoked and that sort of thing, and everyone came and shook us by the hand, you know, and wished us well. And we got to Zost, and we were stuck in a civilian jail there. We marched very closely up there, and you know, after a fortnight in there, we were sent back, and I'm not really sure the sequence thing, so I never took much notice of it. There's I'm just trying to think where we went from there. I think probably went to Poland from there. I went to Thorn and then to Poznan. While I was in Thorn, I met this chap we talked about earlier, von Werra. He came into our room one night. It was an underground sort of dungeon, and it was summer, and there was a bash on the door, and it was opened. And because in Poland we were, as a reprisal, we were locked into our rooms at night.
Because of the
that's right, Canadian thing, yeah. And anyway, he came, one of the guards opened the door, and I think there were half a dozen of us in the room, and he came in, and he's got his mess kit on, little white short jacket, and a couple of bottles of wine stuck in it, and he said, right, he introduced himself, said who he was. He'd escaped from Canada and got to America and back, and said, come on, you know, what are you doing about escaping, and why are you here, and that sort of thing. And we said, well, we've already had a go, and we chatted about it, and he produced this wine for us, and we had a very convivial evening, and he sort of said, right, well, good luck, chaps, and went. And I was enormously impressed with him. He was a very, very nice guy. I was very sorry to see in the Wiltshire Veerbacter about 6-7 months later he'd been shot down over Russia and killed.
He apparently did a tour of prison camps, didn't he?
I believe he did, yes. And anyway, that was that. And after that, we went back to Eichstadt, of course. And there, I got involved with Frank Weld and Harvey Bailey, who organised this tunnel from the lavatory in the ground floor of Eichstadt.
Was that a hutted camp, or?
No, that was a barrack sort of camp, you know, three buildings running parallel with the main road, with of course a barbed wire fence between the buildings and the main road, and it was built on rock, and the other end was the River Salzach. So the Germans thought it was pretty escape-proof, because the river on one side and a main road on the other side, and being built on rock, they thought it'd be very difficult to tunnel, which indeed we discovered it was. And at either end they got their own buildings at either end, so there's no way out there except through the main gate, which is, I'm sure you're well aware, Tony Rolt and Tubby Broomall and so on eventually did go out. But as far as my efforts in the tunnel, we a trap had, when I was introduced to the affair, the trap for the tunnel had been made in the lavatory, and they had tunnelled down alongside the wall, an inner wall foundation, and they'd started to make a hole through the concrete of the foundation to excavate a chamber on the other side. And I eventually went through the concrete, through the hole in the concrete, and began the excavation of the chamber, and dug a great deal of the chamber eventually, and that was a sort of command post for the tunnel, which was to go under the road and then up the hill beside a chicken coop, which was that we knew was up there, and so people could exit.
I think I seem to remember seeing a map of this. It went up quite steep.
That's right.
There were rocks.
Right, there were indeed. It was very difficult digging. Anyway, because I was not a very claustrophobic character, I did a fair amount of digging, and there were one or two serious obstacles, because we were digging, as the Germans rightly discovered, over rock, and so in one or two places we had very little earth above us. I could actually feel the wind blowing on my face when I was digging, and see the grass roots. So we had to be very quiet, of course, if people walking along the road or sentry was patrolling, because they could undoubtedly hear us. Anyway, we kept digging, and we came to a very large. We had one detour around a boulder, then we came to another boulder which was above us, and we had to get under this, and you could just about wriggle your chest through and get through. And after so many days we got to the end. In the meantime there'd been a bit of a panic, because notices had appeared written in English, pinned on doors, saying that the Germans know there's a tunnel, and so everything was closed down while an investigation was carried out, because we didn't know whether it was some British officer trying to be funny, or whether it was a friendly German who spoke English and had heard there was a tunnel. And to the best of my knowledge, it was never ascertained where those notices came from. Anyway, we gave it up for a time, and then we started again and nothing happened, and then we kept going until the day came to exit. And the idea was that we could try and get 25-30 people out the first night, close it up if it's successful and nobody got spotted, and open it up again the second night. So the first night came and it was aborted, so we all had to go back. And then came the night when it actually took place, and George Drew and I got out fairly early, and just behind me was a chap named Screwy Wright, who was in the Hussars, and behind him was my old RSM, Sergeant Major Perry, the tank regiment, who was a very good guy indeed, and behind him were 2 French Canadians. And we had to lie in the tunnel quite a long time, and it was very dark and very stuffy and quite panicky, I suppose, if you weren't used to it. And I heard behind me, I heard one of these French Canadians start to panic and scream and shout. And I heard a little conversation behind me from Screwy Wright. "Sergeant Major, sir, kick that bastard in the face." "Very good, sir." Bang! Because you're lying head to tail, you see. Put his boot in this guy's face and shut him up. It was a wonderful little cameo of a conversation, you know, typical British Army. "Sergeant Major, sir, put your boot in his face." "Very good, sir." Bang!
Was this the one where you came up slightly short of where you intended?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we did. Came a bit short of the hen coop, yeah. Oh, HB, I got it wrong. And anyway, we got out, and George and I, off we went. And I don't know, 30 odd people wandering about the countryside. They all got clear, and eventually we came on a guy named Elms Neal, who was after the war he became a British Leyland dealer in Hertford, I think. He subsequently died, but he was on his own, and he said, could he attach himself to us? So we said yes, okay, and we went off, and we got to the Danube just after the confluence with the Lech. The River Lech flows into it, so the Danube was quite wide, and we knew there was a road bridge there, and that's what we were aiming for. And it was a brilliant moonlit, full moon night, and I said we better lie up, I think, and just see what happens. And so we lay up there, because I had a feeling there'd be a sentry at either end of that bridge, because we didn't know at the time, but we learnt later that they had treated it as a home guard exercise, and they'd turned out the land watch. You know, about 60,000 home guard had been turned out covering the whole area, because altogether something like 60 odd people got out, because the second night was successful as well. But anyway, we saw there was a sentry on duty, and so we thought that's that. We've got to get across the river somehow, and we found an old flat-bottomed boat in a bit of an inlet, which was padlocked with a chain to a post. So we attended to the padlock, and we all got in this thing. There were no oars. There was just a pole, which was all right in the shallows. But once we got out, pushed it out into the middle of the Danube, it just sort of went round and round, and it was off at about sort of 6 or 7 knots, whatever the river was flowing at, quite swiftly. And wasn't quite the idea. We weren't going straight across, but I knew enough about boats, and eventually we get to the other side, and we with the help of the pole and so on, we managed to get it across the other side, but it must have been a good 1.5 miles, 2 miles downstream by then, and we managed to grab the undergrowth that was growing out of the bank, because the sort of thing was swept past, and hauled ourselves up the bank, and no idea where we were by then, of course. But there was we came to a little village, and we sent Elms Neal ahead. He got sneakers on, and we said, look, you go ahead about 50 yards, and we'll follow you, and went down this little main road sort of into the village, and ahead I saw a glow of a cigarette. I thought, stop. Of course, old Elms Neal was ahead, and he couldn't, he hadn't spotted it, and he got, when somebody challenged him, and he turned around to run. By this time we were getting over somebody else's garden walls and things. George and I had gone, and he got shot in the back with 12-bore pellets and things, but fortunately he got a pack on his back, some cheese in it, which took the brunt of the blow, and he was caught. Anyway, that was that. They were pleased to caught him, I think, and so George and I went on our way. The sort of cross in the middle on usual steps, and as we approached it, a couple of German soldiers were walking in the opposite direction, so we had to get right down, and as they went round the cross, so we went the other way, and they didn't spot us. And we looked to our left, and there was an alley which looked like a road going somewhere. So George and I thought, well, we'll get out of the village quickly that way. And we started to go down there, and I saw a German coming out of the door, a German soldier coming out of the door with a towel around his neck, and he's washing things. And we'd walked right into German barracks. So nobody had spotted us, so we turned around and walked away and carried on. We kept going, and eventually we were lying up during the day, and at night we were trying to get food from allotments or whatever. And we lay up on quite a steep bank above a very narrow lane, country lane, and the bank, I suppose, about 15 feet high, very sheer drop. And we could see 3 or 4 village houses and smoke coming out of the chimneys. They lit fires later in the evening, that sort of thing. And we waited till everything went quiet. The dogs had stopped barking and the smoke had gone, and it was getting dusk. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and we thought everything's dead. We'll go down and see if we can find the odd turnip or whatever, potatoes. And so we had to slide down this very steep bank, and as we launched ourselves down this bank to hit the road, a German cycle patrol came round the corner and we were caught, and that was that. They marched us off into said village, and we were put in a stable, and 2 Luftwaffe guys were on leave, were deputed to look after us, and we chatted to them during the night and that sort of thing.
You were presumably taken back to Eichstatt?
Yeah. We eventually, I'm just trying to think, just trying to sort out which escapes were which, because no, that was I'm mixing you up. That was a Warburg. That's how he got caught. When I said I couldn't remember how he got caught from Dusseldorf, that was how he got caught Dusseldorf.
Oh, right.
But no, going to the Eichstatt escape, George and I had done very well. We got over Danube. All that's perfectly satisfactory. We were moving south, going towards Augsburg, and by this time we'd lost Elmsneil. We're on our own, going towards Augsburg, and we arrived on the outskirts, and it was very dark and quiet, and we, you know, the big towns like big city, to walk around it's a hell of a job. So we thought we'd take a chance and try and walk through Augsburg, and we got picked up in Augsburg and put in Gestapo jail in Augsburg, where we were interrogated fairly heavily and put in cells and that sort of thing. We're extremely wet by this time as well, and cold. But we had 1 or 2 incidents in there, because there was a young girl in a cell opposite to us, only about 15, and she was crying and one thing and another, and so we decided to pull rank. We'd already told the British officers and that sort of thing, and we'd been in the cell 3 or 4 days, and eventually I said to hell with this, and I shouted loudly and rudely at one of the warders and said I want to see the commandant. So he came eventually, and all clad in his leather jacket with his iron cross mitschwert, you know, around his neck and all the rest of it, and stood there, and what is this, what do you wish? And I said, well, you know, you German, are you making war on children now? You know, there's this little girl across there sobbing her socks off all day. Is this what the German army does?
Did you speak German? Or?
I spoke enough. And then, of course, he said, no, there's Gestapo. It's a Gestapo jail, you see. I have no authority. Anyway, eventually she was moved somewhere, whether for better or for worse, I don't know. But then they decided to move us, because I think that there's a great deal of needle between the German army and the Gestapo, and the army wanted to claim us. So they moved us some other part of the building, from the away from the Gestapo hands. And we'd had nothing to eat before, but this time now they had us in the evening to eat in the mess with the troops, with the German Unterofficers and things. And they had a big map on the wall of North Africa at the time. It was just at the time they're getting kicked out of North Africa, and that sort of thing. And sort of losing on the Russian front as well. Everything was going wrong for them. And we pointed this out to them, and they were queuing up to give us their names and addresses, saying how well we had treated you well, this sort of thing. This is where I live, and like that. It was quite pathetic, really. They wanted to please us, and eventually, again, we were sent for, and duly returned to Eichstadt, where we were put in the cooler as usual. And from there we went to we were the last two people to be caught, actually, from that escape. We'd been out longer than anybody else. We got through. We learnt later that we'd a cordon of home guards that they had put round. We saw our posters on. We were going through a village one night, moonlit night, and we saw on the wall of one of the houses there's a big poster with our pictures on it. We had shaven heads, of course, and our numbers. These men are dangerous, do not approach them, escape prisoners. And later on it had been pouring the rain, and we took refuge in the bus shelter, and a German troop came on his bicycle with his rifle and everything, obviously get out of the rain, shone his flashlight around, his bicycle lamp round, and spotted us, and we both got up looking a bit rugged, because George is about 6 foot something, and he said, "Nee, mein Herr, and schlafen Sie," and jumped on his bicycle and went.
Were you heading south again?
Yeah, we didn't know where else to go, really. We were heading south, Schaffhausen, hopefully, Augsburg. And so there we were, and that's how I arrived in Colditz. I was then sent to Colditz with so many others.
So you arrived in Colditz in 43?
End of 43 sometime, yeah.
And what about, do you remember your first impressions of the place? Had you heard of it before?
I hadn't, no. I didn't know where we were. I hadn't got a clue where we were going, no. It was, to me, just another prison camp, and we went in through the double gates into this cobbled courtyard, and were shown to our quarters, and Berger, I think Berger and his boys were there. Some of the senior French officers were there, that sort of thing. But in general, the other people who were there were Peter de Vomicourt and his mates, from Fresnes prison, the spy types, the radio operators and people who had been dropped into France. And there I was, so the rest of it is a sort of story really, that I got involved in the making of the glider, and
was that the main sort of nefarious activity you were involved in?
Apart from just brewing a lot of alcohol, very good quality alcohol, which we marketed. We kept ourselves in alcohol quite well, actually, because Mickey Farr, whom I messed, his family business was Hawkers of Plymouth, wine merchants, who make Hawkers slow gin by appointment to the royal family and that sort of thing, and so he had great knowledge of making sparkling.
And you made your alcohol from what?
Well, we started off making, several people tried making alcohol, and they made it from the sort of turnips we were given to eat and this sort of thing, and potato, and the Germans would occasionally confiscate some of it. They could refer to it as Jalka, which is the manure they spread on the fields, the liquid manure they spread on the fields, and it's terrible stuff. But Red Cross parcels were coming in then, not regularly, but enough, and they had quite a lot of dried fruit in. And we made ours out of dried fruit and sugar, and yeast, of course, which we got from the Germans, and made very good quality stuff, really. And we would brew it and bottle it and then trade it for more dried fruit, so that we always had enough surplus to take care of our own requirements, handing it out to other messes in return for some of their dried fruit, which we put back into brewing again. And Mickey had this business that he made a very good sparkling wine, actually, because I can't remember what the process was, but he seemed to get it to sparkling wine, and he would lie it on the windowsill in the snow with the stopper in and slightly tilted down, so the sediment would go to the bottom of the neck where it would freeze. He'd then remove the stopper, and the sediment would be popped out like a cork, and quickly replace the stopper, and then we had a bottle of very good, clear, sparkling wine. And we also made something like Abukar with the ordinary brew, with some Red Cross honey, and stirring it up.
But some people use that terrible jams.
Yeah, used German jam, yes, which was turnip jam.
Which wasn't quite so.
The Yalka, that made the Yalka. Yeah, it's terrible. The stuff we made, you could, as it was coming, we made several varieties of still. There was a Lady Astor Mark 1, Lady Astor Mark 2, Lady Astor Mark 3, and they were made out of these kitchen cubles, big soup things, aluminium soup things, the lid, and seal the lid with medical bandage and medical plaster, gips. Put the lid on, have a take-off coming out of the lid with a water jacket around the outside so you could cool it, water going in one end and out the other, and get the heat under it, put it on the stove. And the alcohol that came out initially, you could catch in a teaspoon, it would burn with a clear blue flame. It was brilliant, it was about 95% alcohol, yeah. So of course it thinned out as it went, so everything was evened out, but it's pretty potent stuff. And we had 1 or 2 good parties on that. But that was the only other, and of course eventually the Germans would come and late at night. We were sitting around about 2 o'clock in the morning, they'd come and confiscate a still. Then we had to make another one. The French Canadians tried doing the same thing, and they made one elementary mistake. They were making it out of their jam and stuff, and when you put the lid on and sealed it with the tape, you had to put a filter underneath it, otherwise obviously the outlet was going to get blocked with the solids, and they didn't know about it, they forgot that, and there were 2 of them round it, and the top blew off, and all the scalding hot jam blew in their faces, and really they were really badly burnt. Yeah,
so it was quite a dangerous activity.
It was, if you didn't know what you were doing. Yes. Anyway, we were always very successful. It was myself and Mickey Farr and Peter Van Rood and the old Bag Dickinson. And we had 1 or 2 good sort of mess parties on that.
You were saying about the glider. You actually worked in the workshop.
Yeah, on the glider. I didn't know anything about the glider, of course. It was initiated, as you're well aware, by Jack Best and Bill Goldfinch, Tony Relt, and it must have been quite well on the way when I was first approached by Tony. Come and have a look, and I went to see what they're doing and was shown what was going on, and I was then sort of said, "We've seen what we do. Would you like to give us a hand?" I suppose I was asked in the same way that I'd been asked to join HB's tunnel at Eichstadt, because I'd already had some experience of what was going on, and reasonably handy that they knew my sort of background. Yes, it had. It was all referred to as heavy industries, and the glider itself was Spirit of Colditz, and everything was done on a need-to-know basis. People who worked on it never asked questions about who else worked on it. I mean, you got an idea. Obviously, occasionally you'd pass each other, but the story is well documented now, and you don't need me to tell you about that, obviously. But my part in it was a very small part, and I was in no way an instigator of anything at all, really. I was just a hand, another pair of hands making things, and very happy to do that I was. But the people that were really the motivators and the brilliant thinking behind it all were Jack Best, Bill Goldfinch, Tony Rolt, and nothing could have been done without Bush Parker and Mike Edwards on the keys. They were the real. They were the people. Yes.
Bush Parker. I've heard of his names come up so many times. He was quite a
Australian, small Australian, extremely athletic, enormously charismatic. He could charm the birds out of a tree, and could chat to the Germans, and get things from the Germans.
He was a conjurer too, I believe, was he?
Pardon?
He did magic tricks.
Oh yes, yes. He was a great magician. He'd sort of been doing that pre-wars. I don't know if he'd done it professionally or not, but he certainly he was his sleight of hand was excellent. Yeah.
He worked in some sort of a circus.
Circus, that's right. Originally, yeah, he's a great athlete and a very good all-round sportsman, and determined to get out again. And Mike Edwards, of course, who was a regular soldier in a Welsh regiment, he discovered he had this great aptitude for, making keys and things. And there were so many people who contributed their various skills, of course, in Colditz.
You weren't in Colditz as long as some of them.
Oh Lord, no!
Do you remember any times of great boredom? I mean, you seem to have been fairly active on the escape front in your life.
Not really. I was never really very bored. We played a lot of games in that cobble courtyard, especially handball and that sort of thing, which I was fairly good at, and I played a lot of that. And I also I read a lot. I like reading. We had a fair number of books in the camp sent by the Red Cross and so on. And
did you get involved in the theatre or?
No, I was never involved in anything. I was never involved in studying or the theatre or anything like that. Merely things I suppose I did the things I enjoyed. I enjoyed brewing alcohol and making the bits and pieces to enable us to brew it. And I enjoyed reading. I thought it's an opportunity to read fairly heavy stuff, and I read quite a lot of fairly classic literature, and played games and worked away on the bits of the glider and things like that.
Do you remember much about any of the German staff?
Not much, no. When you arrived at camp fairly late, so much seems to be sewn up by the original inhabitants that you're always an outsider in effect. And I just did what I was told, within certain limits. But Pupka seemed a sort of reasonable sort of chap to me, and Eggers, I never had a lot of time for Eggers. Some people said, oh, he's not a bad chap, and so after the war, and he came to England and that sort of thing. But
most people's reaction is similar to yours, actually.
Well, are they?
Yeah.
That's interesting, yes. I got the feeling that some people in Colditz sort of felt, well, he wasn't a bad chap after all, But
I mean, one or two people have said that he was, for the Germans, he was the right man for the job.
Oh, he's the right man for the job.
But
sure.
Most of them say that he was a bit of a slimy chap.
He was slimy, yes. A bit of a double take, yeah. He'd say one thing and do another. But the old Pupka was okay. He was a good, sort of gentleman, I think.
When you arrived at Colditz,
yeah.
Coming from Eichstadt, you arrived in quite a big group, didn't you?
We did, yes. We walked in there, yeah.
And that must have made a bit of a ripple, because some of them have been in there quite a while and quite established, I think.
They were. This is what I'm saying. That you were sort of upsetting the establishment. You were always outsiders, really, especially if you wanted to escape, as obviously some of us, having arrived, did, because so many people were there, had been there a long, long time. They'd all had their efforts at escaping nullified by the Germans. They'd tried virtually everything, as you well know. They'd been over the wire, they'd been through tunnels, they'd been through the front door, they'd been out of windows, they'd changed the guards. And everything had been sealed eventually, and there was an atmosphere of, we've done it all, we can't what do we do now, we can't do it. That's where I think our original thinking, perhaps, about the glider was a bit novel to them. Yeah. Those that were in the know and knew about it, I think they were quite astonished that sort of fresh people had come in with a fresh outlook, and people who'd been around a bit as well, because a lot of people in Colditz had been in Colditz just for, had one escape attempt, been caught almost immediately and stuck in Colditz.
We were talking about it when I interviewed Kenneth yesterday, I spoke to Kenneth yesterday, and we were saying there that some people seem to have, as you say, escaped once and were put in Colditz.
That's it.
Escaped loads of times and never did go to Colditz.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah. And of course, other people. I met my friend Edgar Hargreaves, who'd been dropped into Yugoslavia. He eventually arrived in Colditz. That was a big reunion for me, and we had an awful lot to talk about. Stopped us getting bored. And I was boxing quite a lot. And I boxed with Dougie Barder fairly regularly because he liked me, because I think he was Barder on his tin legs was enormous shoulders and forearms, you know, and he could whack you really hard. And I think too many people, he got 1-2 people to box with him, but I think too many people were apprehensive of it. Not apprehensive of being hurt by him, but apprehensive of having a go at him. Didn't want to knock him off his tin legs. When he found that I'd been doing some boxing, he said, come along, and he said, now for God's sake, you don't be frightened, come and have a go at me, you see. And boy, you know, if you got too close, you didn't half get hit. I mean, he pulled no punches. Oh, he's a bloodthirsty guy. I mean, he'd shout when we were playing stool ball or anything in the courtyard where people could get hurt on the cobbles, because it was a fairly rough game, and he was shouting for blood, you know, get in there, kill him, you know. He liked a bit of blood.
Because he'd been a rugby player before.
Yeah, he was on the verge of the England 15, yeah, when he lost his legs, had his crash. But he said, come, you know, you have a go at me. And of course I got hit once or twice, bloody hard. But I think he liked me because I didn't pull any, I tried to hit him, and it was quite good. I quite enjoyed it. I think he did as well, really. He didn't do it for very long, 2-3 minutes at a time, you know, a round or a couple of rounds, and that was enough for him on his legs. But so I didn't really get bored. I always seemed to have quite a lot to do once in a while, a bit like being here.
So do you remember much about the actual liberation? I know the tank regiment guys, which you were, were greatly in demand when the tanks appeared on the horizon.
That's right, yes, that's right. I remember very well the 2 GIs coming through the main gates. I remember them walking in. And the next thing I can still remember, was Dougie Barder and the back of a Jeep with this female American war correspondent. He'd lost no time at all, and he went, long before any of us got out, he went off with her. Yeah, and he was away, which is understandable. I remember the Prominente being taken away as well, and all that sort of jazz. But yes, I can remember watching the American aircraft flying actually below us up the river and machine gunning things, and I can remember a guy watching a guy go across the bridge and being told to halt by the Americans, and he didn't, so they shot him dead. And I went out in a little 3-cylinder DKW 2-stroke car. We'd all be given different jobs, and I was in this DKW with a couple of Americans who wanted to know where something was, and they went to a filling station in the village. Oh, I know, they wanted to see if I get films for their camera. They all got cameras, aren't they, films. First of all, went to the chemist. Well, the chemist, they were quite prepared to pay. You know, they wanted to pay. They were waving dollars about. And this German, the chemist, wouldn't serve them. You know, he surly bastard German. He hadn't realised they'd lost the war, I don't think. And so they just took what they wanted, and then they swiped every single thing off the counter and the glass cabinets. You know, just so next time you'll be a bit more polite. Yeah. And then they wanted some petrol. I went up to a filling station, and the guy there was even worse. He was ranting and raving and shouting. He wasn't going to serve pigs and this sort of thing. And the Americans had enough of this, so one of them just shot him. We helped ourselves some petrol, and that was it. And then the Germans were around us, and I can remember that one or two of these Hitler Youths had been rounded up by some of the Americans and brought in, and they were very surly, you know, and one of them had pulled a dagger out and had to go at a doctor who was trying to attend to him, and they were in a sort of group, and they were suddenly told to stand up by these Americans, and they just sat there, real surly sort of 17-year-olds, you know. They'd been out with Panzerfaust and things, and so the Americans just loosed a round or two off amongst them. They sort of soon stood up then. I can remember these sort of incidents. I can remember Eggers being taken up to see the glider. It was brought down to the room below and was put together, and his astonishment. You know, I have to think he's a camp security officer with his team of ferrets everywhere, and we'd actually built a glider right under his nose. He knew nothing about it. That really fooled him. But for the rest of it, I can remember we were then taken in GMC 6x6s to an airfield and put on Dakotas to come back. And we were buzzed once or twice on the way, and then we had to land somewhere because we were running out of petrol. I can remember the crew telling us we all had to go and stand in the nose for some reason, because the balance of the aircraft wasn't quite right because they were running out of petrol. We had to land and pick up some petrol at another airfield, and then eventually we got back to England to, I think we flew into Northolt eventually, and were taken by trucks to some hutted camp somewhere, and in the morning we were given rail passes to go home and told to report back in a fortnight or something, and that was it. And I went back to Hampstead to a debriefing place there, and I was very, very fortunate because my godmother lived in Hampstead. She lived in Finchley, East Finchley, that's right, had a house in East Finchley just around the corner from this place in Hampstead where we were being interrogated. And to my amazement, when I got there, I found the officer in command of this outfit where I was being interrogated was Major King, John King, who had been my company commander, and he'd been captured and repatriated because he'd badly wounded, and he got this sort of soft job when he recovered, and he sort of greeted me very nicely indeed, and we had a long chat, and he said, well, you know, he said, these guys are doing debriefing, don't really know much about it, but what do you want to do? And I said, well, my godmother lives around the corner, and I'd very much like to. He said, you don't stay with her, you just turn up here in the morning and go back when you finish, that's all right by me. So I was very lucky, I did that. And I was also lucky later on because I was sent to Coleg Harlech on a course, to sort of bring me back into the world of the army, you know. And we went to this army sort of place, and we formed up after dinner in the evening for our inaugural lecture, our introductory talk by the commanding officer. And I thought, I know this guy, and I saw him looking at me. And after the talk was over, you know, chatting and that sort, he came up to me and he said, "No, I know you, don't I?" He was about my age, you see. And I said, "Yes, but you've gone up a bit in ranks since I last saw you." He said, "Where was it?" And I said, "It was in Catterick. We shared a room." He said, I said, "You were the camp education officer." And you had a bloody bicycle that was forever breaking down. I kept mending your bicycle chain for you. God. He was a half colonel by then, you see, in the education outfit. And I had, by this time I got married soon after I got back, which is perhaps a mistake. Anyway, my first wife was with me, and I put her in the big hotel in Harlech, whatever it's called. There's a major hotel there anyway. She was seemed to be the only resident. And I told him this, and I said, "Don't stay here. get off up there, stay with your wife, and come down here again. Come down in the morning, you know, midday you can finish and go back. So I did that. So I was dead lucky to meet two people.
So you stayed in the army for how long after?
Oh, as little time as I could, because I volunteered for parachute regiment, because I thought, well, I went to Elmhurst instructor, that's right, when Sandy Cameron was Colonel Commandant down there, and I went down there to teach a course riding motorcycles, strangely enough, to ride bikes cross country, because immediately pre-war, when I was at Catterick in the 7th Battalion, I was involved with the international 6-day team which was competing in Germany for the Hunline Trophy, which is a trophy given by Hunline, who was a sports fuhrer in Germany, for service teams, or ambulance teams, police teams, whatever. And they presented this trophy because the 6 days trial was being held in Germany, and they imagined a German team would win it. In fact, the tank regiment team, which was Freddie Riss, Ginger Wood, and Corporal somebody else, so 3 of them, the team of course, and I was officer overseer of that for a time, and we had special Nortons, and we could ride around the place, and it was on one of these occasions. Of course they were in Germany. It was held in late August, and they were recalled. We had to recall the team from Germany before the war, before the balloon went up. Yeah. And
eventually, after the war, you went into racing again.
Yeah. I went raced bikes for a time, and then went into cars, and I had one of the very first Cooper 1000s with an HRD engine in, and then moved on from there to driving other people's cars and more of my own.
But that's another story.
That's another story. That's another 14 years. Yeah.
Pat, that was great. Thanks ever so much. The tape's just about run.
Yes.